All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Today we are going to be talking about a historically important group known as the Radical Faeries. Now, I think I would start by asking if any students have heard of the Radical Faeries, and I imagine the response would be zero, to which we would then proceed and explore perhaps why uh, students may not have heard of a group that has had the impact that it has had. But before we get into the radical fairies specifically, I think it's important to set the context in which they existed and they formed. So many of you have probably heard of the counterculture movement in the United States that happened in the 1960s. Some of your relatives may have talked about a concert called Woodstock. Um, if they're older, you've likely heard the term hippies. You know, when we think of hippies and that whole imagery of flower power, anti war, peace, right? The peace signs and all that good stuff. That term hippie and that imagery was largely popularized in this country during what was known as the counterculture of the 1960s. And while you've likely heard of that to some degree, and it is in most history textbooks as a significant era in the United States, you probably have not heard very much about the LGBTQ involvement in that era, and certainly not a whole lot is said about the radical fairies, which were very much a part and an extension of the counterculture efforts in the United States that first began in the 60s. But before we get into the radical fairies specifically, I think what will help to give you all an idea of the tone and the just general energy and attitude towards gay people and activists at that time. So this is a clip of a talk show that aired on primetime television by the host with a host named Jack Parr, and then of course I would show the video and we would sort of examine his questioning is fairly hostile and he talks over them and he's very blunt about certain terms and not wanting to be told what he can and can't say, and he accuses them of proselytizing, which is, of course, he's saying that they're not simply asking for equal rights. He's accusing them of preaching and demanding that they are treated exceptionally well or better than other people or special and not simply wanting to be treated equally. Um, and then, so after we watch the video, I think I would take the moment to then say, you know, show of hands, how many of you think that this clip actually contains some language or questioning that you have heard still being used nowadays? Has do the criticisms in this video still echo today? Do we see them on TV or in interviews or even, amongst our own families and communities? And I imagine, hopefully, a couple of them would maybe say yes or nod. So, what's important about history like this, and why I am teaching it to you, is oftentimes when we talk about civil rights and minority issues, particularly nowadays, as I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, are aware, it's June. We're currently in Pride Month, so a lot is being said in the media about LGBTQ people and the movement and equal rights and the history to some degree. But it's important to examine this stuff because the more we look at it, and what many of us understand part of the purpose of looking at history is to learn from it and understand how we got to where we are today, and perhaps learn from both mistakes and triumphs of efforts in the past to see if we can continue to progress and, of course, create a more equal society for everybody. That, of course, is the big end goal. But as you will see as we continue, within these larger, broader movements, there are subsets and there are individual groups within the larger umbrella that have different ideas on what should change and what should be done and what shouldn't change. Um, and a lot of this stuff, very fascinatingly, has a great parallel with the times we live in right now. In addition to it being Pride Month, I'm sure most, if not all of you, are familiar with Black Lives Matter and that movement. And so you're living in a time where we're kind of going through a resurgence of these high profile movements and efforts towards civil rights, and in essence, to some degree, a counterculture, so to speak. So, what I hope you take away by the end of this is you'll see none of this is really new, and a lot of the same conversations people were having decades ago back then are similar, if not the same, to the conversations we're having now. And the reason for that being is these are real issues, right? Um, you may have heard people in the media or, maybe someone in the community, someone you know personally. Oftentimes you'll hear people criticize issues regarding gender or identity or LGBTQ stuff, and you'll hear them say things like, "Gosh, the world is so complicated today. There's so many different labels and identities, and they're just coming up with new ones every day. And gosh, things used to be so much simpler back in the day." I'm sure some of you have heard that sentiment in response to something at some point. But as you saw in this video clip, this is the 1973. We've been having conversations like this for quite some time, and we are likely to continue having them, so long as people recognize and feel that things are not equal for everyone. So, getting back to specifically the radical fairies, with a name like that, gosh, you just want to know what the heck is it? The radical fairies are a worldwide network and a countercultural movement, although even some of the people who founded it took issue with that definition. As you'll see, there's a lot of disagreements about specifics sometimes in a movement like this, and people have very clear ideas on what they want it to be, and other people have different ideas. And so, but broadly speaking, it can be described as a general movement and a network of people around the world now, but it was founded right here in the state of California in Los Angeles in 1979. So this is, the counterculture largely took off in the 60s on a mainstream level. And that counterculture had to do with just a general anti establishment. We don't want to be told what to do anymore. The Vietnam War was a big part of that. People were tired of what they saw as, you know, conflict that wasn't necessary or wasn't right, and so there was a movement for peace and resistance to military intervention. Um, and then, of course, the civil rights movement with famous individuals like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And Malcolm X, and the civil rights movement for African Americans in the 60s. That civil rights movement really segued into a broader counterculture movement and just a general sentiment that, you know what, a lot of us don't like the way things are. And we'll get into the specifics of what they didn't like about the way things were and what changed here in a moment. But specifically, the radical fairies sought to redefine what they called queer consciousness. Now, I'm sure some of you might be aware, but if you're not, the word queer was a word that was used derogatorily towards LGBTQ people. Historically, it has been used as an insult and a slur, but in recent days, and as you can see, not even just recent, this is one of those examples of things that have been occurring for decades now. We simply don't talk about the history as much, so it can seem like it's brand new. But the word queer, even going back to the time of the Radical Faeries, was being used and reclaimed by the gay community as a way of them to take ownership of it and use it as a way to describe themselves in a sort of an all-encompassing way. Although different people have some different ideas on if queer refers to more specific things or if it's a general term. Some people don't agree with reclaiming it. They feel like it's a slur and it's an insult and it brings up a lot of trauma for them. And so you'll find there are people within the LGBTQ community that don't agree with reclaiming the word queer at all. But this is, according to the Radical Fairy movement, um, they wanted to redefine queer consciousness and they placed a special emphasis on spirituality. And we'll get more into that in a minute, but spirituality is really the influence. You'll see that they were heavily influenced by the general counterculture hippie movement of the 70s. So it's founded by two gentlemen by the name of Harry Hay and Don Kilhefner. And Harry Hay, you'll see this image of him, that is one outfit that he wore. And take a moment just to sort of look at what he's wearing, because it is relevant to the entire ideology of this group and some of the concepts we're going to be discussing as part of this lesson. You'll notice he's wearing a skirt or a dress, right, with floral print. But then up top, it's more of a what we would describe as masculine. In fact, he looks like a farmer up top. He's got the hat and the buttoned sort of heather shirt and a normal T-shirt underneath. Although it looks like the T-shirt might also have some LGBTQ imagery. You can't really see it underneath everything. But yeah, so a very broad mix of gender norms existing right in that outfit, and we'll get into that more in a minute. So we know it's a movement. We know it existed along with just the general hippie countercultural sentiment that was going on in the United States during this era. But what specifically were the Radical Fairies trying to do? What did they believe? And what is so specific about the Radical Fairies that separates them from just the larger LGBTQ movement that was occurring at the time? Well, the main thing they wanted to do was reject what they referred to as hetero imitation. And we have some other terms that really touch on that whole premise that I will go more in depth, I believe, on the next slide. But they rejected something they referred to as hetero imitation. Now, putting that together, hetero meaning heterosexual and imitation obviously meaning copying someone. So they felt that the broader LGBTQ movement was simply trying to imitate straight people. In other words, it was gay people who, in addition to just wanting to be treated as equals, they were trying to make themselves seem the same. And so what are some examples of hetero imitation? Well, hetero meaning heterosexual, but what often comes with the most basic mainstream idea of what relationships and sex might be? And then I think maybe that would be a good opportunity to just ask them point blank, like, what is, when you think of a traditional relationship between people, what are some details of that? When you say a traditional relationship, and then I would ask, and they might say a man and a woman, they might say, the other things like he goes to work and she cleans, depending on how far back they want to go with the examples. But I'd say, yes, good examples. So yes, they felt that the larger gay movement was trying to imitate straight people, and they rejected that and instead said, no, we need to embrace the fact that we're different, and focus on those differences and highlight those differences and create a culture and a movement that is our own rather than trying to assimilate or trying to fit in with the very same culture that has been rejecting this whole time. They felt, why do we want to be like the people we feel have mistreated us? We don't want to change who we are. Isn't that kind of the whole point? Is not changing who we are at all and just being accepted for all of the things that make us different. So that was their view. Again, that was not necessarily shared by the larger LGBTQ movement or many gay activists. There were plenty of gay activists who did indeed want to create lives for themselves that were very traditional. They wanted to be able to get married. They wanted to be monogamous, a couple, just two people, monogamous, living in a house together, maybe get a dog, a car, all the traditional things that we associate with a family. Um, these are some things that a lot of gay people wanted, but within the radical fairy movement, they said, maybe we want different things, and maybe we want to focus on the other alternative ways of doing things, which we will get into a little bit more. They also wanted to challenge commercialization. Now, commercialization, if any of you are on TikTok or Twitter or both, you may have seen some of this conversation happening today because indeed it is, and I have some articles we'll show later on in the lecture. But you may have heard the phrase, depending on how online you are, rainbow capitalism. Now, capitalism obviously is the system that we live under. It's far too complicated to get into today, but people, businesses, right, are very large and they make money and they sell things and they use branding. And so commercialization is something that is still being criticized to this very day within the LGBTQ movement, which is to say, this was a movement that was started by people who were rejected by mainstream society. They were rejected by most people. They were rejected by corporations. They were rejected by the media, right? And nowadays you see companies like Coca-Cola making their logo rainbow. Every company, right? For Pride Month right now. They update their social media profiles and they change it to the pride colors, and a lot of them sell merchandise, and these were things that the radical fairies, in keeping with the whole counterculture, rejecting the status quo mentality that was very popular during the time, they didn't like the idea that companies and corporations were what they felt were taking advantage of the movement and taking away from the real issues and making it oversimplified. All of a sudden now it's just about wearing a rainbow colored t-shirt as opposed to all these different things where we feel we're not allowed to be who we are and we're not treated as equal citizens. And so then that goes along with the anti-establishment. They very fiercely felt that they were a self-contained group of people. They took care of themselves. They did not believe in involving themselves in mainstream society. And they took it to quite an extent because also popular during this time, again, is the hippie movement and these sort of eco-feminist movements and trends at the time where a lot of things and a lot of gatherings were being held outdoors. There was this really big focus on nature. Again, the flower power, the hippies, they really embraced nature, and that was a huge part of the essence of the sentiment of the time. I mean, you can see Harry, that skirt he's wearing covered in flowers. Again, that was just part of the imagery. Flowers were used to symbolize, gentleness and peace and nature, and it was sort of it was a way of using imagery that was the opposite of war and violence, right? When you think of war and violence, you think of like tanks and missiles and guns and all that stuff. So it's hard to find something that's the opposite of that more so than a pretty little flower, right? So, that was a big part of it. And so specifically, their philosophy dived into elements of anarchism and environmentalism. Anarchism simply meaning they believed that authority, in particular the existing authority figures in our society and the existing system, back then, you may have heard people making jokes of, referring to everything as the man. That was, if someone's uptight or too traditional or corporate, they might say you're working for the man. So they really believed that authority figures, government, the existing power at the time was the source of their inequality. The government failed to consider gay citizens equal in the laws that they wrote. Gay marriage was not legal. Police brutality towards gay people at the time. I mean, that's, as many of us know now, how Pride itself was started, was largely inspired by these Stonewall riots where police entered a known gay bar and just started um, beating them up for what they were wearing, the way they were dressed, and that was sadly acceptable for the police to just walk in and do that at the time. Obviously, we're still having conversations about police brutality today, but in a time like this, they were just entering establishments and brutalizing people specifically because they were gay. And so to the radical fairies, they go, the police are not on our side, the government is not on our side. These are the people who are oppressing us. These are the people who are preventing us from being treated equally. And so we reject it. We don't want to live as part of any mainstream culture. We want to live on the land. We want to live in nature. We're sort of these little communities, and they were very focused on establishing just their own community exclusively for queer people. It was started by men, and it did have a focus on gay men, but they grew to embrace gender queerness, as it were, and it is just uh, a broader focus on people who were not obviously heterosexual and did not fit the traditional idea of masculinity. And that is what we are going to get into next. That picture is more recent. You'll see the radical fairies are indeed still a thing today, and we can discuss what exactly they do today and what impacts they've had at the end of this. But before we go any further into the history of the radical fairies themselves and what they accomplished and what they believed, let's go back to when we said reject heteroimitation. And I had sort of touched on that and said heteroimitation means to try to be exactly like straight people and the mainstream culture of what a relationship is supposed to be and what your home life is supposed to be and all that stuff. So specifically when we say reject heteroimitation, what the radical fairies were sort of touching on is a concept that we now refer to as hegemonic masculinity. Now, those are some, hegemonic seems like a very big word, I understand, but let's start with masculinity, right? That's a word all of us have likely heard in some form. If something's masculine, right, it means to be manly. And so masculinity is the ideals of what it is to be a man. Hegemonic, simply put, is obviously it's a very highly academic term, and so you could read a lot more about it than we're going to here today. But hegemonic simply means that there is a ruling class in our society, which you've probably encountered a lot of conversations centered around that entire dynamic, the ruling class, right? People like Bernie Sanders talking about the billionaire class and the elites, and there's a lot of conversations happening regarding that, and how wealthy people seem to have more and more of the say in our society, and people are questioning, how much is too much for one person or a group of people to have. So those are conversations we're having now. So what the word hegemonic refers to is recognizing that the ruling class of people, or which would be the wealthiest people, have the means to impose their beliefs onto the rest of us. And how do they do that? Well, for example, Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, now owns the newspaper The Washington Post. And just the other day, I was reading The Washington Post ran a headline saying, in essence, why people shouldn't criticize billionaires so much. And in the picture, they used a picture of Jeff Bezos. And so people on Twitter quickly took notice and they go, wait a second, the guy who owns this newspaper is the one they're using for the picture on the front page and to run a story saying, be nice to billionaires from a newspaper that's owned by the very billionaire that we're printing this article about. So that's just one example of how wealthy people and people with power have ideas. They have their own set of beliefs. All people have beliefs and opinions. But if you have lots of money and you use that money to have influence over newspapers, television, and culture in general, then the beliefs of the powerful people start to become and influence the beliefs of the rest of the people in a country. So, specifically with regards to masculinity, hegemonic simply means that the ruling class view of what it is to be a man and what masculinity is and how it should manifest in society. What should men do? What should men dress like? What should men sound like? What should they look like in general? What is their role in society? All these things that we think about with regards to what it is to be masculine or manly are influenced by the people who get their stories and perspectives published on the news or in media or with social media now. If someone is for example, verified on Twitter, um, now not everybody with a blue check mark on Twitter is a supervillain, but I'm saying um, people with influence use that influence naturally, and so the opinions they have personally receive a lot more coverage and a lot more attention than, for example, some of the opinions you or I might have, because outside of this classroom, no one is listening to us right now. No one's listening to me give this lecture except for all of you. If I was on CNN talking about this, more people would hear it and be influenced by it. So that is all it's simply saying when we say hegemonic masculinity is the ruling view of what masculinity is and the standards and expectations for people within masculinity and how that impacts all of society, not just people within the ruling class who hold those views. So, with that said, I think it'll be a little bit easier to understand it if we apply it to ourselves. So, how do gender norms, which is what masculinity is a part of a broader concept that we refer to as gender norms, which is simply if you're a girl, you're supposed to act this way. If you're a guy, you're supposed to act this way. There are only guys and girls, some people would say, if they're criticizing, the notion of gender fluidity or nonconforming. Gender norms are the expectations of people with regards to the gender they have been assigned with or identified with by society. So, for example, if some of you, when you were younger, if you're a boy and you wanted to play with makeup, then you might have received some feedback on that. Or if you're a girl and you don't like makeup, you might have received feedback on that because it's not what people tell us is the norm. So why would people want to challenge these? Why would people like the radical Faeries say we reject the norm? We reject the mainstream idea of what men are supposed to be, whether they're gay or not, because part of this is you can be a gay man, but you can still be masculine, right? You can still look like what people expect a man to look like. You can still wear suits and ties and dress accordingly and have deep voices and all these things that fall within masculinity. So just because someone's gay doesn't necessarily mean that they're not influenced by masculinity or that they're no part of it. Yes, in traditional masculinity and the gender norms, being gay is not considered part of the ideal. The ideals are all what we referred to earlier when we talked about heteroimitation and why they were critical of that. The the ideal is picture the most stereotypical 1950s black and white couple on TV, right? A man, a woman, white, heterosexual, monogamous, just the two of them. You know, they have children and all that sort of cookie cutter, very broad and basic idea of what love and romance and relationships are supposed to be between two people. So these are the things that, in general, some of the counterculture was pushing back. There were feminist movements, and even within the LGBTQ movement at the time, there were specifically lesbian movements. So people were pushing back against this, and among those people were, of course, the radical fairies. So why would people want to challenge that? Why would people feel like this dominant idea of what genders are and what they're supposed to act like be challenged? I think the easiest way to understand that is for us to take some time to reflect on ourselves. So I've handed you all a worksheet, which is the social identity wheel. And I'm going to give you some time and we're going to fill these out. And obviously, you don't have to share anything that you don't want to or that you're not comfortable with. But the goal here is to get you to think about your own self and your identity a little bit closer than maybe you're used to. And so you'll see there's a list of 5 bullet points there asking you to reflect on the details, and then the wheel itself around the edge, you can see it's labeled. Um, Fill that in, think about it for a few minutes, and then we will have a discussion. Then I would obviously give them time to do so, and we would come back to the discussion. Now, obviously, this wheel has a lot more things on it than just gender or sex. It has race, ethnicity, your economic status, your religion. And the reason I still chose to use this wheel, even though we are focusing more specifically on a history and a movement that deals with gender than some of these other concepts, is um, we are not separate pieces. We are all complete, whole, one person, right? And so, for example, I'm a gay man, but I'm not gay and then also a man, right? There aren't days where I choose to be just a man and I leave the gay part of me at home with my wallet that I forget half the time. No, I, I every day I leave my house. I leave my house as a gay white man. So all of these layers uh, exist within us, and they are important to recognize because they shape our experience. My experience as a white man is obviously different than the experience of a black man. But my experience as a white man is also very different from the experience of a straight white man because I'm a gay white man, right? So all of these layers to our own identities are inclusive. Well, they're all inclusive, and it's a term we call intersectional, which is meaning simply that they intersect with each other. They're not separate pieces, it's all intertwined together to make up who we are and what we identify with. So, now that we've shared a little bit about our identities and which ones we think about, which ones we know for a fact have shaped our experience, um, let's think about why, with regards to gender identity and sexual orientation and sex, people might say, hey, we're not too thrilled with the pressure that we all have to be straight and monogamous or in relationships committed at all, you know. Oops, got a little ahead of myself. So the radical fairies existed to push back against this mainstream culture that they felt was not just existent in the United States on a mainstream level, but within the gay community itself and the gay movement. They really felt that gay people who were indeed advocating for equality were advocating for it in a way that they just wanted to be copies of straight people and the norms that they mostly rejected. Basically, I guess you could look at it this way: the radical fairies are like thinking to themselves, this gay movement, all it really wants to do is just keep the gay part, but change all of the other stuff, not be flamboyant, not be in dress and drag, not wear, certain outfits or express themselves. They felt like maybe where this is headed is a society where gay people make sure that they are as reserved and traditional looking, not dyeing their hair a bunch of different colors. Men don't wear dresses, women don't wear, leather jackets or whatever. They felt like maybe they were headed in a direction where, yeah, technically people are allowed to be gay in the sense that two men would be allowed to kiss each other in public and hold hands. But beyond that, everything else would still be maintained in terms of the what is acceptable and what is mainstream. And if you don't fit into that, it can be really hard. If you are a human being who likes to wear makeup, but you are not recognized as a woman, and society says, well, if you're not a woman, you can't wear makeup because it's wrong, it can be difficult, right? And maybe you just naturally don't fit the description that people say you should. If you're a guy and you don't have a deep voice, and people say, well, that's real men are supposed to have big, deep voices, or maybe you can't grow facial hair, and that's a pressure to do that, to be able to do that, because it's seen as manly to be able to have more hair, right? And the point being is that when you tell a gigantic country of people that what they are allowed to be is such a small little box, just a small little box, and if you do not fit within this very small box, you are weird or wrong, or some people would say, a sinner or an abomination, or these cause people to be deeply unhappy because it's not a matter of just being bullied, although that certainly is part of it, right? If someone is made to feel like an outcast, if everybody sort of agrees that certain people are outsiders and we can treat them differently if we think they're weird, then that's going to be a lot of violence, a lot of bullying. But beyond that, it's very invalidating, right? It's as simple as this is who I am, and you're telling me I can't be who I am, who I really am. And so I feel like I'm being forced into the closet, or I'm being forced to pretend to be something I'm not. And so that was what the radical fairies were very concerned about and worried about, even within the gay movement itself. Are they headed towards a direction where they're so desperate to get straight people's approval that they're just going to try to look and act as close to straight people as they possibly can, basically? So, what impact did they have? That is the general idea of what the Radical Fairies did when they were founded. Obviously, there's a lot more you could dive into in the history, and you're certainly welcome to do so in your own time. There's plenty of it on the internet, but that was what they represented. That was what they started as. Now they're a worldwide, loosely connected network of people that still exist, and a lot of the conversations they were having are still being had. This is an article from June 5th of this year from CNN. Whether it's rainbow capitalism or bad design, LGBTQ people are calling out disingenuous pride merchandise. So that's the pushback against commercialization, which um, one could argue that that's only increased, right? I mean, it seems like every year there's more of the companies using rainbow profile pictures or selling merchandise, and it seems like every year at the Pride events, there's another, even more companies and corporations being involved. And so this is exactly something, the exact same conversation that the Radical Fairies were having back in the very late 70s, early 80s was We do not think that this is consistent with Pride, which is a movement for people who were rejected by mainstream society trying to create a celebration for themselves. And we don't feel so comfortable. In fact, some of them would say it's being appropriated, it's being taken advantage of just to make a quick buck, right? A lot of people say, oh, these companies don't really care about us. They just know that if they put rainbow on something, people will buy it. And this is a very nuanced conversation. This one's a bit, but I know I've seen people on TikTok talking about it. So, again, if you're on TikTok or even Twitter or the internet in general, you may have come across this. But currently, and it seems every year, we are also having a conversation within the LGBTQ community about what is allowed at Pride, not just, saying maybe we don't like corporations at Pride and commercialization, but also what is referred to as kink at Pride. Now, kink is a whole other topic we could go into, but basically it involves uh, the gentlemen you'll see or the people you'll see wearing leather. You might have seen pictures, or if you've ever witnessed a Pride event in person, there's entire communities of people wearing leather. There's some people who wear outfits that are made of leather and they look like puppies. There's a whole lot of different cultures and subcultures, but generally speaking, that's what the word kink is referring to, is people who are dressed with a um, specific culture, like the leather community, right? So every year there's a debate where people say leather, men wearing leather, and that whole leather community is inherently sexual. It's a sexual thing. Kink is a word referring to sexual fetishes, and so if something is a kink, then it relates to sexual desires. And so, how appropriate is that to do in public when there's this big giant event where there are, you know, some children present, some people come with their families, but in general, doing something sexual in front of people who did not consent, right? Who did not agree to it, who didn't have a chance to, is generally obviously seen as the wrong thing to do, right? Consent is something we should always have before engaging in any behavior like that. But there's very heated debate on, is someone simply wearing a leather outfit sexual? It's not like they're naked. It's not like you can see any of their parts. They're simply wearing leather outfits. Yes, in some instances and for some people, it can involve a sexual component, but is just wearing leather and showing up as a leather community something that should be allowed at Pride or not? This is very much a conversation that happened back then. And they started the New York City Drag March, which was the Friday before what they said was the corporate sponsored NYC Pride March, intentionally a week before. And you'll find nowadays that there's typically a main Pride event, and then oftentimes there's a market days, or there's some sort of alternative event that exists around the same time frame that a lot of people view as not being interfered with by politicians and companies, and it's more focused on the community itself. Well, back in the 90s, the Radical Faeries, in their form at that time, started the New York City Drag March, and the Drag March was not only to offer an alternative to the commercialization, but also it was in response to, indeed, attempts to ban leather and drag queens and people who dress in drag. These were conversations happening several decades ago. People said, no, you shouldn't be able to wear leather in public like that. And frankly, they thought drag itself was too sexual, too provocative in nature. And so this goes back to that general sentiment that the radical fairies were talking about back then. And even though nowadays not that many people call themselves a radical fairy, not that many people are associated with it, but many, many people, particularly on the internet now, are having the exact same conversations and sharing many of the same views as the radical fairies. Um, And so that you could argue that that's the impact they have had. They were really the first group, certainly of their size and organization, but they were really the first main group to introduce these countercultural, sort of contrarian notions to the broader mainstream LGBTQ discourse. And they very much resisted the banning of leather and drag. And they said, this is exactly what we're talking about, right? When we say hetero imitation, you're trying to turn us into straight people, and you're frankly saying many of the same things as the homophobic straight people said. Why do you have to throw it in our face? Why do you have to dress gay? Why can't you just keep it to yourselves, right? And so the radical fairies said, no, this is the whole point of this is to reject that. And so we're absolutely not going to let pride happen if people are not allowed to wear leather and dress in drag. Now, this was in response to attempts to ban leather and drag. Obviously, today those things are generally still allowed at mainstream pride events, but they wanted to make sure that if anything were to happen, there was an alternative and a space for those things to exist. And so that is a quick rundown. I mean, again, there's a lot of nuanced stuff here. You can really get into the more spiritual aspects of what they believed in, elements of paganism and uh, all that sort of good stuff, right? They really had a lot of ideas and a lot of different ideas, and they somehow found a way to fit a lot of very, very different ideas regarding spirituality, identity, community under one banner, which is the Radical Fairies. And they do still exist today. Um, Again, they're not that mainstream, and so part of what I hope you take away from this today is when you have previously been taught in history classes about civil rights history, about counterculture history. I'm sure this is not the first you have heard of the hippie movement or the counterculture movement in Vietnam. Certainly hope it's not the first you've heard of it. Um, if it is, now you know. But why do we not talk about LGBTQ contributions? We rarely, certainly when I was in high school, and I'm assuming it's been true for most of your public education, when you talk about the civil rights era and you talk about the counterculture, you're lucky, really, if the textbook mentions gay people at all. But then within that simple inclusion, there's a lot of fascinating and relevant history here. The radical fairies represented some very, very distinct ideas as to what would make life better for LGBTQ people. And those very same ideas and very same conversations are happening amongst us today with the modern pride movement and all of the agreements and disagreements therein. So, yeah, just something to think about with regards to we talk about heteronormative, all that stuff about what is acceptable, what's not, what's mainstream, what's deemed important. All of those things that the radical fairies were pushing against is sadly, ironically, the very same attitudes that have prevented them from being included in most history lessons. Our history textbooks are frequently, right, influenced by what we talked about earlier, the cultural hegemony, right, the hegemonic masculinities. Though, who makes our textbooks? Companies, corporations, right? Who owns the corporations? Well, if you look at the numbers of who makes up the wealthiest parts of our society, the kinds of people who own companies, including textbook companies, it is predominantly white, wealthy, straight men. And so when white, wealthy, straight men influence what's in our textbooks, it's a good chance that that's why perhaps we're not hearing the full story. We're not getting all of the details, even important ones that give us a full scope of what exactly that period in history looked like and who all participated and contributed to it. So, yeah, with that, I would like you, I'm pretty sure we are out of time today. If this were an actual class, I'm very positive it would be. Have the reflections ready. I would have the students have the reflections ready before next class, so they have some time to think about, what did you learn? What to you did the radical fairies represent? Do you feel like the ideas they had are relevant today? Um, are these conversations you've had with maybe your friends, or have you seen conversations like this or similar to this online or on the news? What has been your experience with any of the things that the radical fairies were talking about? And then also reflect on, even if you're, for example, not gay, or an LGBTQ person at all, those identity wheels. We all have identities of some sort, and those identities shape our experience. And so, sort of reflect on how you might have related to the radical fairies and their desire to create a culture where they could be all of themselves and not just part of themselves. And what is the big takeaway here? What was the big takeaway for you? All right. Well, that's going to do it for today. So thank you, everybody, and have the reflections by next class. They don't have to be super long. Just again, a paragraph will do. But if you want to write more, certainly I will be interested to read them. And I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. I will see you next time.